Welcome to The Funnel Effect.
Yeah, it is great to be here. Really looking forward to this one.
Today, we're going to do something a little different for our deep dive. Usually, we look at broad trends or big abstract concepts.
Right.
But today, we are going to act almost like forensic accountants visiting a crime scene. We are looking at a medical mystery that involves life, death, a massive amount of money, and a really fascinating detective story that played out in an operating theater in the UK.
It sounds a bit dramatic when you put it that way, but honestly, this story deserves the drama. I mean, it's a classic case of David versus Goliath.
Yeah.
Only in this case, Goliath is a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical narrative, and David is, well, a generic drug derived from pig intestines.
I do love a good underdog story, especially when it involves pig intestines. But before we get into the biology and the economics, we need to be incredibly precise with our source material for you listening. We are dissecting a specific landmark paper today.
We really need to lay out exactly what we are looking at.
Right. So the article is titled Unfractionated Heparin versus Bivalirudin in Primary Percutaneous Coronary Intervention in brackets, HEAT-PPCI, an open-label single-center randomized controlled trial.
And that was published in the Journal of the Lancet back in 2013.
Exactly. And I'm going to read the authors credited with this work because it is quite a list. We have Adil Shahzad, Ian Kemp, Christine Mars, Keith Wilson, Claire Room, Rob Cooper, Mohammed Andron, Claire Appleby, Mike Fisher, Aleem Khan, Babu Canadian, Joseph D. Mills, John L. Morris, William L. Morrison, Shahzad Munir, Nick D. Palmer, Raphael A. Perry, David R. Ramsdale, Periaswamy Velavan, and Rod H. Staples.
Yeah, it is a very long list of names. But as we unpack this deep dive, you will see exactly why.
Oh, absolutely.
Because this wasn't just a paper written in some back office. This was a massive logistical operation that required the buy-in of almost every single cardiologist, nurse, and technician in one of the busiest heart hospitals in the UK.
And their affiliation is the Institute of Cardiovascular Medicine and Science at the Liverpool Heart and Chest Hospital NHS Foundation Trust in Liverpool, UK. So let's set the stage for you. We are dealing with the most critical event in cardiology, the STEMI.
ST segment elevation myocardial infarction.
Which to the average person is just a jumble of letters. But if we translate that into the actual patient experience, what is happening in that moment?
Well, this is the Hollywood heart attack.
Yeah.
It is the clutching of the chest, the sweating, that impending sense of doom you hear about. Physiologically, one of the major arteries feeding your heart muscle has been completely blocked by a blood clot.
Suddenly.
Suddenly. Zero flow.
And the clock starts ticking immediately.
It does. In cardiology, we use the phrase, time is muscle. And it is not just a catchy slogan for a poster. Every single minute that the artery remains closed, heart muscle cells are actively dying.
Because they're starving.
Exactly. They're suffocating from lack of oxygen. Yeah. If you wait too long, that muscle turns into permanent scar tissue, and the patient is left with severe heart failure.
And if you wait way too long,
the patient dies. It is that simple.
So the entire goal of the treatment is speed. You have to get the plumbing open.
Exactly. And the gold standard treatment for this is primary PCI, percutaneous coronary intervention.
Which is really just a fancy medical way of saying fixing it through the skin.
Right. No chainsaws, no cracking the chest open. We puncture an artery. Classically, they do this in the groin, but increasingly it is done in the wrist. And we thread a long, thin plastic tube called a catheter all the way up the aorta directly to the heart.
While the heart is still beating.
While it's beating. We find the blockage. We pass a microscopic wire right through the clot. We inflate a balloon to literally smash the clot against the artery wall, and usually we leave behind a stent.
A stent being that little metal mesh tube.
Yeah, think of it like the tiny spring inside a ballpoint pen. It acts as a permanent scaffold to hold the artery open and keep the blood flowing.
Okay, so on the surface, this sounds like a straightforward mechanical problem.
Yeah.
You have a clogged pipe, you snake the drain, you prop it open, and job done. But the human body is not a copper pipe.
Not at all. And that is where the conflict of this entire deep dive lies. You see, the human body is designed to vigorously protect itself from foreign objects.
Right.
If you stab a piece of metal or plastic into a blood vessel, the body screams injury.
It thinks it's bleeding to death.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It triggers the coagulation cascade. Platelets, which are the sticky little cells in your blood, swarm to the foreign object. They try to seal it off. They try to form a massive clot.
Which is the exact opposite of what you want when you are literally in the middle of trying to clear a clot.
It's a cruel biological paradox.
Yeah.
You are performing surgery to remove a clot, but the physical act of the surgery triggers the body to make brand new clots.
Wow.
Yeah, and if a clot forms on your catheter or on the wire or inside that brand new stent you just placed, it's absolutely catastrophic. It can break off and cause a massive stroke, or it can reblock the artery instantly while the patient is still on the table.
So to safely do the plumbing work, you have to shut down the body's defense system entirely. You have to thin the blood.
You have to paralyze the clotting mechanism effectively. You need incredibly powerful anticoagulants, and this is where our two fighters enter the ring.
Okay, let's introduce the contenders for this trial. In the blue corner, we have the old guard, unfractionated heparin.
Heparin is an absolute dinosaur in medical terms. It was discovered way back in 1916 by a medical student, actually. It is a biological product.
Meaning it comes from animals.
Yes. Historically, it was derived from dog livers, then beef lungs, and now mostly from porcine intestinal mucosa.
Pig intestines.
Pig intestines. It is a very complex biological sugar chain. It works by accelerating a protein in your body called antithrombin, which in turn shuts down the clotting enzymes.
Sounds kind of messy.
It is messy. It's biological. It varies a bit, but it is incredibly cheap, and it has been the absolute workhorse of medicine for nearly a century.
Okay, so that's the old cheap biological option. Now in the red corner, we have the challenger, Bivalirudin.
Bivalirudin is the sleek, modern upgrade. It is a synthetic molecule. They call it a direct thrombin inhibitor.
Which definitely sounds a lot more precise.
It is more precise. It was actually designed based on Heparin, which is the naturally occurring anticoagulant found in the saliva of medicinal leeches.
Oh, wow. So we really have pig guts versus synthetic leech spit.
Welcome to modern pharmacology.
Right.
But the main selling point of bivalirudin was its precision. Because it binds directly to the clotting enzyme, it has a very predictable effect. And crucially, it has a very short half-life.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning it washes out of the body very quickly once you stop the IV drip.
And why was that quick washout considered better?
It all comes down to safety. The narrative for years leading up to this 2014 study was that heparin was a blunt instrument that caused too much bleeding.
Okay.
Bivalirudin was marketed heavily as the safer choice. The pitch was it will stop the clots during the procedure, but because it washes out fast, it won't make the patient hemorrhage afterward.
And bleeding in this specific context isn't just a minor nuisance, right? We aren't talking about a paper cut.
No bleeding in a PCI procedure is a major predictor of mortality. Yes, if you bleed into your brain, or if you have a massive bleed in your groin where they put the catheter in, your chances of survival plummet. Your body is already under immense stress from the heart attack. So preventing bleeding is a massive priority for cardiologists.
So on one side, we have a very cheap drug that might cause bleeding. On the other side, we have a designer synthetic drug that claims to be much safer. Let's talk about the cost difference, because this blew my mind.
This is the jaw-dropping part of the story. Bivalirudin costs approximately 400 times as much as heparin.
I really want to let that sink in for you listening. 400 times the cost. That is the equivalent of choosing between buying a coffee for $5 or buying a coffee for $2,000.
That is a very fair real-world comparison. The markup is astronomical.
And hospitals were just routinely paying this.
They were paying it gladly. By the time this study happened, Bivalirudin had become the undisputed gold standard. It was a Class I recommendation in the international guidelines.
A Class I recommendation means you essentially have to use it right.
Basically, the logic in the medical community was, yes, it is incredibly expensive, but how can you put a price tag on safety? If it saves lives by preventing major bleeding, then it is worth every single penny.
Right, that logic totally holds up if it is actually better.
And that is the multi-million-dollar big F.
So let's head over to Liverpool. The authors of this paper, Dr. Rod Stables and his entire team, they started looking at this expensive gold standard, and they got suspicious. Why did they doubt what everyone else accepted?
Well, they looked deeply at the previous trials, the big landmark studies like Horizons AME and Euromax that had originally established bivalirudin as the king.
Right.
And they noticed something really strange hidden in the fine print of the study design. They noticed that the fight hadn't actually been fair.
Okay, so we are getting into what we call the unfair fight hypothesis. Explain this to me like I am 5 years old.
Okay, let's use a racing analogy. Imagine you want to race two cars to see which one is faster. Car A is our cheap drug heparin. Car B is our expensive drug bivalirudin.
Got it. Heparin is Bivalirudin as the car B.
So in the old trials that made bivalirudin famous, they put heparin in car A. But they also hooked a heavy trailer full of solid bricks to the back of car A.
A trailer of bricks. What were the bricks in this medical scenario?
The bricks were an entirely different class of drugs called glycoprotein adulia inhibitors.
That's a mouthful. Let's just call them GP inhibitors.
Sounds good. GP inhibitors are basically the nuclear option of blood thinners. You can think of them as super aspirin. They completely shut down the platelets.
Okay.
They are incredibly effective at stopping clots from forming, but they cause a massive amount of bleeding.
I see where this is going.
Right. So in those old trials, the official protocol mandated that the patients randomized to the heparin group also absolutely had to receive these GP inhibitors.
Wait, so the heparin group wasn't just getting heparin. They were getting heparin plus a secondary drug that is notoriously known to cause severe bleeding.
Exactly. They were forced to tow the trailer of bricks. But the Bivalirudin group,
Ah.
CAR-B, they were allowed to drive without the trailer.
They didn't get the GP inhibitors.
They only got the GP inhibitors if there was an absolute emergency during the procedure, what we call a bailout.
That seems incredibly unscientific. I mean, you aren't testing the two drugs against each other at all. You are testing drug A plus a massive bleeding agent versus drug B alone?
Precisely. And guess what the results showed? The heparin group bled more.
Well, obviously they bled more. They were being force-fed a severe bleeding drug that the other group was spared from.
Exactly. But the headline of the study, the part that gets published and read by everyone, was just Bivalirudin causes significantly less bleeding than heparin. It didn't explicitly say Bivalirudin causes less bleeding than heparin plus mandatory GP inhibitors.
And so that flawed headline just became the unquestioned guideline.
Correct. The pharmaceutical marketing machine took that top-line result and ran with it everywhere. Bivalirudin is safer. Bivalirudin is the new standard of care.
So the Liverpool team looked at this history and basically said this is total nonsense.
They said this is an entirely unfair comparison. And by 2012, when they started designing the HEAT-PPCI trial, medical practice had actually evolved anyway.
How so?
Doctors around the world had already realized that using those super aspirin GP inhibitors routinely for every patient was a bad idea because of the bleeding risk. So almost nobody was using them as a mandatory everyday drug anymore.
Ah, so the proverbial bricks had naturally been removed from standard real-world practice.
Exactly. So the Liverpool team asked a very simple but profound question. What happens if we run the race again right now with modern rules? What happens if we compare heparin versus Bivalirudin head-to-head, but we treat both groups exactly the same regarding all other medications?
Meaning no mandatory bricks for anyone.
Right. Only use the GP inhibitors if the patient is physically crashing on the table, a true bailout, and apply that exact same strict rule to both the heparin group and the Bivalirudin group.
So they finally leveled the playing field.
They completely leveled it.
This brings us right into Section 2 of our deep dive, the study design itself. Because this wasn't just a minor tweak to an old paper. This was structured as a classic, rigorous experiment.
It was a beautiful return to the basics of the scientific method. The primary objective was straightforward. First, compare efficacy, meaning does the drug successfully stop the heart attack and keep the stent open?
Right.
And second, compare safety, meaning does the drug make the patient bleed dangerously? And they wanted to answer these two questions in the real world of modern medicine.
I really want to touch on that phrase, real world, because we so often hear about ivory tower clinical studies versus real-world observational studies. What is the practical difference here?
It's a huge issue in medical research.
Mm-hmm.
In a typical pharmaceutical trial, the researchers want the cleanest data possible. They want to prove their drug works without any confounding variables. So they create a massive list of what they call exclusion criteria.
So who gets excluded from these clean trials?
Usually it's the very people you worry about the most in a real hospital. The very elderly. Patients with underlying kidney failure. People who arrive confused or in cardiogenic shock. Or simply people who are too sick to read and sign a complex legal consent form in 5 minutes.
So you basically end up testing the drug on the healthiest sick people you can possibly find.
Exactly. Just to give you context, in that older Horizons AMI trial, the mortality rate of the patients enrolled was about half of what we actually see in the general public having heart attacks.
Wow.
That tells you immediately that they heavily cherry-picked the safer, more stable patients.
Which is a massive problem, because if I am an ER doctor, I don't get to only treat the safe, stable patients. I have to treat the 90-year-old grandmother who rolls in actively in shock.
Precisely. And the Liverpool team recognized this flaw. They wanted to know, does this drug work for everyone? Their internal motto was literally, every patient, every time.
But there is a massive legal and ethical hurdle here, isn't there? Informed consent.
Yes, and this is honestly one of the most fascinating aspects of the HEAT-PPCI trial design. Under normal rules, to be in any scientific study, a patient has to fully understand the risks and sign a detailed consent form beforehand.
But if I am actively having a STEMI, I am in 10 out of 10 crushing chest pain. I am probably being pumped full of morphine. I am terrified. I might be vomiting. I am in absolutely no position to carefully read a 10-page legal document.
You really aren't. And practically speaking, if the doctor stops everything to slowly explain a 10-page legal document that is 10 or 15 minutes where your coronary artery is still completely blocked.
And time is muscle.
Right. Delaying a life-saving treatment just to get a signature on a research form is arguably unethical because it directly harms the patient's heart.
So usually those highly critical patients are just entirely left out of the study.
Right, which skews the data. But Liverpool utilized a very rare protocol called delayed consent.
How exactly does that work legally?
Well, because both heparin and bivalirudin were already fully approved standard of care drugs. Neither one was an experimental unknown chemical. The ethics committee allowed the doctors to randomize the patient first.
So the patient rolls in the hospital doors, and the computer immediately assigns them to Group A or Group B without asking.
Yes. The doctor just opens a sealed envelope, sees which standard drug to use, gives the drug, and fixes the heart immediately. Zero delay. Zero paperwork up front.
And then what? When does the consent happen?
Then once the literal dust has settled, maybe the next afternoon when the patient is sitting up in bed, pain-free, having a cup of tea, the research nurse comes into the room and says, "Hi, yesterday you had a massive heart attack. We enrolled you in a comparison of two completely standard drugs. Here's what we did and what happened. Are you willing to sign this form to let us keep your anonymized data for our research?"
That seems like a massive gamble for the researchers. What if everyone just said no? You'd lose all your data.
That was a huge fear going into it. But here's the amazing thing about how it played out. Almost nobody said no. Out of 1829 eligible heart attack patients who came through the doors, they managed to successfully recruit and keep the data for 1812 of them.
That is, what a recruitment rate of like 97%?
Over 97%.
Yeah.
That is practically unheard of in modern clinical trials.
That is spectacular because it means there is almost zero selection bias in this study. The patients in this trial were the true unfiltered population of Liverpool. The 90-year-olds, the people in shock, the sickest of the sick, every single demographic was included.
Exactly. It gives the study massive internal validity. Critics cannot look at this paper and say, oh, they only looked at the easy cases to make their numbers look good.
It makes the resulting data incredibly robust and impossible to ignore.
Absolutely.
So we have a fair fight, no hidden trailer of bricks. We have a real unselected crowd of patients. Now let's talk quickly about the venue itself, the Liverpool Heart and Chest Hospital, because this was a single-center trial.
Yes, and that is a detail that is often cited by critics as a limitation. They will say, well, it's just one hospital in the UK. Maybe they just do things uniquely there.
Is that a valid critique in your eyes?
To a certain extent, yes. It is generally always better to have multi-center trials across different countries to prove complete generalizability. But the strong counterargument here is procedural consistency.
Meaning what?
In a massive multi-center trial with 50 different hospitals, every hospital does things slightly differently. Different techniques, different nursing protocols. In a single center, you can tightly control all those variables. Every doctor followed the exact same strict protocol.
That makes sense.
And we should note, Liverpool is a very high-volume center. They perform about 1,000 to 1,200 of these primary PCI cases every single year. So they definitely have the patient volume required to generate statistically significant numbers on their own.
And there's one crucial procedural detail about their specific technique that we need to highlight: radial access.
Yes, this is vital context. 80% of the patients in the HEAT-PPCI trial had their catheter procedure done through the wrist, which is the radial artery, rather than the groin, the femoral artery.
Why does the entry point matter so much for this specific drug story?
Because anatomically, the wrist bleeds significantly less than the groin. The radial artery is small and right against a bone, so it is very easy to compress and stop bleeding after the surgery. In those older trials we talked about, most patients were done via the femoral artery and the groin, so the baseline background risk of severe bleeding was naturally much higher back then.
But in the modern era, with radial access, the background risk of bleeding is already quite low.
Exactly. The surgical environment had naturally become safer mechanically. So the core question really became, in this naturally safer modern environment, do we actually still need to pay for the hyper-expensive safety drug?
All right, let's get to the main event. Section 3, the data. They ran the study. They tracked all 1,800 patients. They crunched the numbers. What did they actually find?
Let's start with the efficacy outcome. Did the drugs successfully prevent bad things from happening to the patient's heart? They measured this using a standard composite endpoint called MAE.
AMACE, major adverse cardiac events. Break that down for you listening. What exactly counts as a MACE in this trial?
It includes 4 distinct catastrophic events: all-cause death, so dying from anything within 28 days, cerebrovascular accident, which is a stroke, reinfarction, which means having a completely new heart attack, and finally, unplanned target lesion revascularization, which means the stent failed and you had to be rushed back into surgery to fix the exact same artery again.
Okay, so we are looking at death stroke, second heart attack, or repeat emergency surgery. And the results.
The cheap generic drug won,
Heparin actually beat Bivalirudin.
convincingly. The overall APE event rate for heparin was 5.7%. The event rate for the expensive bivalirudin was 8.7%.
That might sound like a small difference to a layman, just 3 percentage points, but in the high-stakes world of medical statistics.
It is massive. The relative risk was calculated at 1.52. That mathematically means that patients who were randomized to receive bivalirudin were 52% more likely to suffer a major adverse cardiac event than those who received heparin.
52% more likely.
Yes. And the p-value was 0.01, meaning there was only a 1% chance this result was a random fluke. This was statistically highly significant.
So the expensive, highly marketed gold standard was actually performing significantly worse in reality.
It was.
Let's drill down into that 5.7 versus 8.7%. What exactly was going wrong for the patients on bivalirudin? Were they dying more often?
No. And that is an important distinction. The rates of actual death and stroke were statistically similar between the two groups. The significant difference was driven almost entirely by the other two factors: reinfarction and acute stent thrombosis.
Stent thrombosis, we mentioned this earlier, the sudden clot forming inside the newly placed metal stent.
Yes, exactly that.
How big was the difference in stent clotting between the two drugs?
This was the really alarming finding. In the bivalirudin group, there are 24 confirmed cases of stent thrombosis. In the heparin group, there were only 6.
Wait, 24 versus 6. That is a 4-fold increase. You had a 400% higher chance of your stent clotting shut with the expensive drug.
Yes, and you have to remember, these are absolutely catastrophic events for the patient. A stent thrombosis means the patient goes from feeling totally fixed and recovering in their room straight back to critical condition in seconds. It is a massive physical and emotional trauma.
Why, though? Why was this highly sophisticated, super precise synthetic drug failing so badly to stop the clots from forming?
The leading clinical theory comes back to exactly what we discussed about its pharmacology earlier, the supposed benefit of its precision and short half-life.
The quick washout.
Exactly. The trial protocol, which strictly followed the standard manufacturer's label instructions, said to stop the bivalirudin infusion as soon as the catheter was pulled out and the procedure was over.
So the drug literally washed out of their bloodstream.
It washed out almost completely within minutes, but the patient's body was still angry. The biological injury signal was still blaring. The platelets were still swarming, trying to attack that brand new metal stent. And because the drug vanished from the system so fast, the patient was left almost totally unprotected from clotting in those highly critical first few hours after the surgery.
And what about heparin?
Heparin is chemically stickier. It hangs around in the tissue longer. Even when you turn off the IV drip, it provided a pharmacological tail of protection that gently covered the patient through that most vulnerable immediate recovery period.
So the exact feature they aggressively sold to doctors, the fact that it clears the system incredibly fast, was actually its fatal flaw.
It certainly appears so from this data. It cleared entirely too fast for the reality of the biological healing process.
Okay, so heparin comprehensively wins on efficacy. It stops the dangerous stent clots much better. But what about safety? Because this was bivalirudin's ultimate ace card. The whole pitch was pay 400 times more and your patient absolutely will not bleed. Did the HEAT-PPCI trial prove that at least?
No. And this was the real mic drop moment of the paper.
What were the actual bleeding numbers?
Looking at major bleeding, which they define using the Banner RC type 3 to 5 scale, Bivalirudin had a 3.5% major bleeding rate. Heparin had a 3.1% rate.
Wait a second. The old, supposedly dangerous heparin actually had less major bleeding?
Numerically, yes, it was slightly lower. Now, statistically speaking, the p-value was 0.59, which means the difference wasn't large enough to say heparin is definitely safer. It was essentially a statistical tie.
But the point is, bivalirudin offered absolutely zero safety advantage, none whatsoever.
Exactly.
So that massive safety benefit from the old trials.
It was a total mirage. The data here proved it was almost entirely due to that trailer of bricks. It was only because they were practically overdosing the heparin patients with GP inhibitors in the old days that heparin looked dangerous.
Wow.
As soon as you removed the unfair handicap and tested them cleanly head-to-head, the cheap heparin was just as perfectly safe as the premium Bivalirudin.
It's almost scandalous when you think about the scale of it.
It really was a revelation for the cardiology world. It overturned over a decade of deeply entrenched medical dogma overnight.
Let's recap this incredibly clearly for you listening. We have drug heparin. It prevents significantly more secondary heart attacks. It causes the exact same amount of major bleeding. And it costs.
Absolute peanuts, literally dollars per dose.
And then we have drug B Bivalirudin. It allows significantly more dangerous stent clots. It offers zero measurable safety benefit. And it costs.
A small fortune.
This brings us cleanly into Section 4, the implications and economics of what they found. Because this isn't just a clinical win, this is an economic bombshell.
It really is unprecedented. In healthcare economics, we are usually forced into dealing with painful trade-offs.
Yeah.
We calculate something called the ICR, the incremental cost-effectiveness ratio.
Right, where you have to balance the budget against the benefit.
Yes. We usually sit around a table and ask, is it truly worth paying $50,000 extra for a new drug if it only extends a patient's life by 3 months? It is a brutally difficult ethical and finance calculation that systems like the NHS have to make every day.
But this study bypasses that entirely.
Exactly. Here we have a rare situation that economists refer to as dominance.
Meaning
The alternative strategy, the heparin, is both definitively cheaper and definitively more clinically effective. There is no ethical trade-off to debate. It is an economic unicorn.
you literally save money and you save lives simultaneously.
Yes,
And the Liverpool team actually did the raw math for their own specific hospital, didn't they?
they did. They calculated that for the roughly 1,000 primary PCI cases they perform every single year, simply switching the routine drug back from Bivalirudin to heparin would save their single hospital £500,000 annually.
£500,000 for just one hospital building in one city.
Think about what a public hospital can actually do with £500,000 in freed-up cash. That pays for extra nurses. That buys new MRI equipment. That provides funding for entirely different life-saving treatments.
Now let's scale that up mentally. Because this isn't just a Liverpool procedure. Primary PCI for heart attacks is done in every major city in the world.
Exactly. In the UK alone, or across the US, or throughout Europe, we are talking about hundreds of thousands of these procedures happening every year.
Millions globally over a decade.
Right. So if you extrapolate these Liverpool savings globally, we are talking about hundreds of millions, possibly billions of dollars being entirely wasted on a drug that the data now shows is clinically inferior.
It is staggering systemic waste.
And we must remember, it is not just financial waste we are talking about. It is tangible clinical harm to real human beings. Those 24 patients who suffered an acute stent thrombosis in the Bivalirudin group, those were real people who had to endure the terror and physical damage of a second heart attack purely because they were given the premium standard of care drug instead of the cheap generic.
I have to play devil's advocate here, though, because when a paper like this drops in the Lancet and basically tells an entire medical specialty they've been doing it wrong and wasting billions, surely the medical community didn't just say, oops, our bad. There must have been massive pushback.
Oh, absolutely. You have to realize entire academic careers had been built on researching Bivalirudin. Prestigious international guidelines were written by top experts who genuinely believed in it. The pushback at conferences was incredibly intense.
So what were their main arguments against the Liverpool findings?
The most common one immediately was the single-center critique we mentioned earlier. People argued, well, maybe the patient population in Liverpool is just weirdly different. Or maybe Dr. Stables and his team are just absolute wizards at dosing heparin correctly.
Is there any actual merit to that specific argument?
As a scientist, you always want multi-center trials to unequivocally prove generalizability across populations. But functionally, the Liverpool protocol wasn't exotic. They weren't using some secret magic form of heparin. They were using standard textbook dosing protocols.
So it's a weak defense.
It is very hard to logically argue that the basic biology of a patient in Liverpool is somehow wildly different from a patient in London or New York.
What about the open label issue? Because the doctors obviously knew which drug they were pulling out of the cabinet.
That is a classic risk for observer bias in clinical trials. The critics argued if the doctor secretly prefers heparin and they know the patient is on heparin, maybe they don't look quite as hard for bleeding complications.
Okay, but did that affect the data here?
Unlikely,
Yeah.
because the primary endpoints they measured here were hard endpoints.
Meaning they aren't subjective opinions.
Exactly. Death is death. You cannot bias a death record. A stroke is a stroke. And a stent thrombosis is a physically blocked artery visible on an X-ray angiogram. You absolutely cannot fake or bias that visual evidence. So the open-label nature almost certainly did not skew these hard clinical results.
And what about the radial access point? The fact that they went through the wrist. I heard critics say, well, since everyone went through the wrist, there just wasn't enough background bleeding to allow Bivalirudin to show off its amazing safety benefit.
I find that argument absolutely fascinating from a logical standpoint. They're basically complaining if you doctors had just used a much more dangerous surgical technique by going through the groin, then our highly expensive drug would have looked so much better in the final spreadsheet.
Which might be technically true, but it's completely irrelevant to modern patient care.
Exactly. The ultimate rebuttal to that is simply we don't intentionally use the more dangerous surgical technique anymore. Medicine evolved. If accessing the artery through the radial wrist physically solves the dangerous bleeding problem essentially for free, why on earth would any health system pay $1,000 for a chemical drug to solve a problem that no longer exists?
It is literally like buying a $2,000 waterproof survival suit for a leisurely walk in the Sahara Desert.
That is exactly what it's like. If the operational environment has changed fundamentally, the intrinsic value of the drug changes with it. Bivalirudin was designed as a solution to a specific historical problem, namely bleeding from groin access, combined with heavy GP inhibitors that simply didn't exist in 2014 anymore.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 5 of our deep dive, the philosophy of evidence. Because this story is so much bigger than just two blood thinners. It is a profound look at exactly how we know what we think we know in medicine.
It is a masterclass in critical thinking. In modern medicine and society in general, we have this deeply ingrained technological imperative.
Tell me about that.
We automatically assume that because something is brand new, totally synthetic, heavily marketed, and extremely expensive, it intrinsically must be vastly superior to the old biological stuff we've used for decades.
We were completely seduced by the stated mechanism of action. Direct thrombin inhibitor just sounds so much cooler and more advanced than pig intestine extract.
It does. It sounds incredibly elegant on a molecular level. But the human body does not care about your elegant marketing terminology. It only cares about actual physiological outcomes.
And the Liverpool team forced the entire field to stop looking at the theory and look at the real-world outcomes.
They did. It also beautifully highlights the immense danger of confirmation bias in science. People really wanted Bivalirudin to be the cleaner, better drug. So when those early trials came out showing less bleeding, nobody looked too closely at the fine print.
They didn't notice the trailer of bricks.
Right. They just blindly accepted the favorable headline because it confirmed what they already wanted to believe about new technology.
And once a formal guideline is written based on that bias, it just solidifies into dogma. It takes a huge amount of professional courage to stand up at a major medical conference and say, the emperor has no clothes.
Or in this specific case, the emperor has a really expensive anticoagulant that is actively causing your patient's stents to clot shut.
It is also a massive win for pragmatic clinical research.
Absolutely.
Yes.
That every patient, every time model. We desperately need more trials designed exactly like this. We need to rigorously know what actually works for the sickest, messiest patients in the real world, not just the carefully curated, stable patients in a sanitized trial environment.
And before we wrap up, we really should mention the funding aspect again.
Yeah.
Who exactly paid for this massive HEAT-PPCI study?
This was entirely an investigator-initiated trial. It was funded largely internally by the hospital itself and through independent public grants.
Which means there was absolutely no big pharmaceutical money behind it influencing the design.
Crucially, no. Because frankly, a pharmaceutical company is never going to intentionally fund a head-to-head trial designed to definitively prove that their multi-billion-dollar blockbuster drug is useless compared to a generic.
Obviously not.
They have a legal fiduciary duty to maximize returns for their shareholders, not necessarily a duty to seek absolute scientific truth at the expense of their own profits. That is exactly why robust independent public sector research is so vital to society. We constantly need independent audits of these established medical truths.
So let's bring this deep dive to a close. Let's briefly synthesize everything we have unpacked here today.
Sure.
We started with a serious medical mystery. Why was the entire developed world willingly paying a massive premium for a cardiac drug that, upon closer inspection, seemed to be failing patients?
And we found the definitive answer hidden deep in the methodology of the historical study design. The previous supposed success of Bivalirudin was essentially a statistical illusion caused entirely by an unfair comparison involving forced bleeding agents.
We saw how the HEAT-PPCI trial finally leveled that playing field. They bravely removed the bricks. They ethically included the actual real-world sick patients, and they simply let the two drugs fight fair under modern conditions.
And the final result was an absolute landslide. The old, cheap, messy heparin won outright on clinical efficacy. It tied perfectly on safety. And it absolutely dominated on financial cost.
It truly is a David and Goliath story where David actually wins in the end.
But David didn't win with a magic slingshot. He won simply because the referees, the Liverpool team, finally stepped up and enforced the rules fairly.
The key takeaway for you listening to this deep dive is to always fundamentally question the comparison being presented to you. Whether you are reading a mainstream news story, analyzing a corporate business report, or looking at a complex medical study, always ask yourself, is this actually a fair fight?
Right. Is one side secretly carrying a massive handicap? Is the historical context of the data completely outdated compared to today?
And remember, high price is absolutely not a reliable proxy for high quality. Technological complexity is not a proxy for actual effectiveness. Sometimes the incredibly simple, really old biological solution is fundamentally the best one we have.
I couldn't agree more.
I want to leave you with a final, somewhat provocative thought to mull over. We just thoroughly learned that the global medical world was blindly overpaying by 40,000%. That is the actual ratio for a heavily marketed drug that was objectively clinically inferior.
It is.
And this went on unquestioned for years. Millions of dollars were wasted. Real patients suffered unnecessary secondary heart attacks because of this flawed assumption.
It is a deeply sobering thought when you sit with it.
So if Bivalirudin was an unquestioned gold standard based entirely on a flawed premise, how many other things are we doing right now across the globe that are simply wrong? What other expensive medical treatments or entrenched business practices or societal norms are we desperately clinging to today simply because nobody has had the courage and the funding to run a rigorous Liverpool-style audit on them?
It really reminds me of that classic old saying we have in medical school, half of everything we teach you here is completely wrong. The real problem is we just don't know which half yet.
A terrifying and incredibly exciting thought to end on. Thank you for watching The Funnel Effect.